We continue now at the top of Daf Chof Tesamad Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 29a. This daf is sponsored by David and Ariella Grossman. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amud or a Daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was dealing with the difference between a machsheves chutz lizmano. Let's say somebody has a machshava, an intention of bringing a carbon at the wrong time. That's during the 4 blood avodos, let's say during the shchita or the kabbalah or the holacha or the zrika. So if he has a machshava of a machsheves chutz lizmano, so then we say that the carbon is pigul, and if someone eats from the carbon, then there's a chiyuv of kares. On the other hand, if there's a machsheves chutz l'makomo, he has intention that the carbon is going to be consumed outside of the proper place, so then that is a disqualification. It's puzzle, but it's not considered pigul, and there is no chiyuv kares, there's no liability to kares in such a situation. And the Gemara in the previous Amud was trying to find the source for this distinction, again, between machsheves chutz l'zmano and machsheves chutz l'makomo. And Rav on the previous Amud said that the source all comes from this pasuk in Vayikra. We'll take a look at the full pasuk. Once again, the pasuk says, Vim he'achol ye'achel mipsar zevach shalomov bayom hashlishi lo yerotza hamakrevo so lo yechashev lo pigol yeh v'anefesh ochelos mimenu avonatisa. So it's from that pasuk that we're going to learn out these halachas by machsheves chutz lizmano and by machsheves chutz l'makomo. And the Gemara in the previous Amud was in the middle of darshaning each part of the pasuk, and right now the Gemara is up to darshaning the part of the pasuk where it says lo yechashev. And what does that mean? It means lo ye'orev bo machshavos acherus. You can't mix in other machshavos, other intentions. And Rashi explains, Lo ye'orev bo machshavos acheros mikan lemachshavos shemotzios zumizu. We learn from here that one machshava can take away from the other, meaning shemachsheves psul motzia midei pigul. Let's say there's some other machshava of disqualification besides for the machshava of chutz lizmano that can take it away from being pigul. Kedetana masnisin keitzad lo karav hamater kemitzvaso. As we're going to learn in the Mishnah later on, it's talking about if the matir is not brought the proper way. That's a reference to this idea that one machshava can take away from the disqualification of pigul. And the Gemara continues, pigul, what does the word pigul mean in the pasuk zeh chutz l'makomo? This is a reference to chutz l'makomo. This was mentioned earlier, that pigul is really an extra statement, an extra word in the pasuk, and so therefore that's a reference to chutz l'makomo. And yihya, when the pasuk says pigul yihya, the word yihya, melamed shemitzdarfen zeh im zeh, that teaches that they can combine with one another. Rashi explains yihya, ason hakasav l'chutz l'makomo l'chutz l'zmano havoya achas. It's one havoya. They're one being, so to speak, the machsheves chutz l'zmano and the machsheves chutz l'makomo. Melamed, and that teaches shemitzdarfen chatzoi shiurein lifsol es hakorban. Let's say you have a machshava for half the shear, half the requisite amount of chutz l'makomo and half the requisite amount of chutz l'zmano. They can be mitzdaref, they can combine. Kiditzanan b'masnisin, again, like we're going to learn later on in the Mishnah, lechol kechatzi zayis b'chutz, kechatzi zayis l'machar pasel. He has in mind to eat a half a zayis outside the proper place, a half a zayis tomorrow, so we can combine that to create the requisite amount, which is a kezayis. And the Gemara continues, then the pasuk says, "V'hanefesh hochelas mimenu." It says the soul that eats from it. And so there we say echad v'lo shnayim. We say only in one of the cases, not in both of them. Only in one of the cases do we say that there's a punishment of kares. Again, that's going to be by chutz lizmano ve'ezeh zeh. Which one of the two, chutz lizmano or chutz l'makomo? Which one of the two has a chi of kares? The answer is chutz lizmano. It's the machsheves chutz lizmano. The gamar avon minoser, because we learn a gzera shava avon from noser. The damile bezayin beis. This we said on the previous Amud. There's a similarity between noser and chutz lizmano, and it's known by the acronym Zayin Beis. Zayin stands for Zman, and Beis stands for Bama. This was mentioned on the previous Amud. They both relate to time, both noser, which is eating a carbon that was left past the proper time, and chutz lizmano, of course, which is a machshava that it's going to be consumed after the proper time. And Beis also, they both apply by Bama, and so therefore, since they have that commonality, we're going to say that it's by chutz lizmano, by machshavas chutz lizmano, that we say there is kares. And Rashi explains the dami le b'zayin beis. They're similar again in the acronym Zayin Beis. V'lo shavke chutz lizmano the dami lenosar. And the Bach has the Gersa v'lo shavkinon l'chutz lizmano dedami l'noser. We're not going to say that chutz lizmano is the one that is not going to get kares. We're not going to say that. Rather, we're going to say that it's similar to noser. The asya gzera shava minei, that gzera shava comes from it. V'nigmar chutz l'mekomo delo dami l'noser b'midi. And we're not going to say that we're going to learn chutz l'mekomo, which is not similar to noser at all. In other words, since chutz lizmano is similar to noser in that regard, and there's really no similarity between chutz l'mekomo and noser, so therefore we say, since that is the case, gamar avon minoser, and we say that it's by chutz lizmano that there is kares. And Rashi continues, V'hadalo shanya Rabba bereish shmaita hachi. Now Rabba had a very similar approach to this approach of Rava over here. So why didn't Rabba give this answer? Ki barchinon ad Rabba chutz l'makomo adif, because the Gemara asked on Rabba's approach. They said, what do you mean chutz l'makomo maybe is better? To samachle, because it's nearby in the pasuk, it's closer in the pasuk. And the reason why we didn't give that answer is mishum dakati lo kamalei gezerah shava, because at that point we still didn't have that gezerah shava. Tatani Levi bar Zavdi the kares benoser ksiv, that Levi bar Zavdi taught that kares is written by noser, the name of the nesias avon the gavi machshava b'dedami lenoser mishtoi, that we would then say that the nesias avon, again it says at the end of the pasuk v'hanefesh ocheles mimeno avonot tisa. So when it says nesias avon by machshava, that we're going to say b'dedami lenoser mishtoi. It's got to be talking about something similar to noser, ho'elumina gamar, since it is learned from there. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Papa le Rava. Rav Papa said to Rava, Lidi dach, according to your explanation that you're learning everything out from this long pasuk, you're learning out the idea of a machsheves chutz lizmano and machsheves chutz l'makomo. So then shlishi de parshas kedoshim tiyu, there was a second pasuk mentioned on the previous amud, the word shlishi in parshas kedoshim, my darasht be, what are you going to do with that? Again, if you would have used one pasuk for chutz lizmano, one for chutz l'makomo, then you're using both psukim. But now that you're using the pasuk in Vayikra Zayin Yud Ches, again the longer pasuk, that's teaching us both chutz l'makomo and chutz lizmano. What do we do with the shlishi in Parshas Kedoshim? And the Gemara continues and answers, Ahumi boy lay, that pasuk is needed for the following, L'makom sheyehei meshulish, it has to be a place, a location that is able to have three qualities, bedam, bebasar, uveimurin, and the three are the blood, the meat, and the emurin, which are the sacrificial portions. And Rashi explains sheyehei meshulish, what does it mean that it has to have all three? It means as follows, V'limed al machsheves chutz l'makomo, that pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim is teaching us that if a person has an intention of chutz l'makomo, a wrong intention, again, during the process of the avodah, he has the intention that he's going to consume the carbon outside of its proper place, she'ena moeles ela o b'kodshei kodshim, the only time such a machshava really works is either by kodshei kodshim, shachishav aleim la'ochlam chutz li'azara, that he thinks that he's going to eat them outside of the azara, the place you're supposed to eat kodshei kodshim is in the azara, so chutz l'makomo is outside the azara, o b'kodshim kalim, or let's say he thinks by kodshim kalim la'ochlam chutz li'ir, that he's going to eat them outside of the city of Yerushalayim, the area you're supposed to eat it is within Yerushalayim. Now what are we coming to exclude? Both of those areas are meshulish, both of those areas apply to dam, basar, and emurin, but Rashi says, prat, that excludes the following, lemechshav le'echol behechol, let's say a person has in mind that he's going to eat it inside the hechol, so let's say it's supposed to be eaten in the azara by kodshei kodshim, and instead he says he's going to eat it in the hechol, in the actual Beis HaMikdash. So that also one might think is chutz l'makomo, but it's not considered chutz l'makomo. The low puzzle there, it's not going to be disqualified. The area that you are thinking wrongly to eat the carbon has to be a makom hameshulish bedam bebasar v'emurin, a place which dam, basar, and emurin apply to, meaning hainu chutz li'azara. That would be, for example, outside of the azara, it's theoretically possible to bring the dam, to bring the basar, and bring the emurin. Now, of course, outside of the azara, really, you wouldn't normally bring all of these things, but it's possible in theory, chutz li'azara, to have dam, basar, and emurin. How could that be? B'shas heter bamos, because there was a time that bamos were permitted. Bamos were when they made a mizbeach, they would have altars outside of the area of the Beis HaMikdash. There was a time period where that was allowed, and so therefore that's an area that's meshulish. It's possible to have dam, basar, and emurin. It's possible that you would sacrifice and offer the blood. It's possible that you would eat the meat. It's possible that you would bring the emurin even outside the azara. But la'afuke hechol, that comes to exclude the hechol, she'ein bo haktaras emurin. It's impossible in the hechol to burn the sacrificial portions. That happens on the mizbeach, not in the hechol. V'lo achilas basar, and there's no eating of the meat also inside of the hechol. And so that's the idea that we're learning from this pasuk. Again, it has to be an area that's meshulash, and that comes to exclude the hechol. But the Gemara continues and asks, if this is what we're learning from the pasuk in Kedoshim, we're learning from the fact that it says again, Shlishi has to be an area that's Meshulish, but typically Mikra Kama, that we could have learned from the first pasuk, Im He'achol Yayachel, this first pasuk, again, the long pasuk, Im He'achol Yayachel Mipsar Zevach Shlamav, Bayom HaShlishi, it says Bayom HaShlishi over there as well, and so you could learn out a Makkah Meshulish from there as well. What do we need the pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim? Mida'afke Rachmana B'Lashon Shlishi, again, from the fact that the Torah uses the language of Shlishi, couldn't we just learn it out from that pasuk? Rashi explains, typically Mikra Kama, Mida'afke Rachmana B'Lashon Shlishi, L'chutz L'zmano, from the fact that the pasuk uses a language of Shlishi to tell us Chutz L'zmano, Uchsiv Bahu Kra, Chutz L'Mekomo, and then in that same pasuk it talks about Chutz L'Mekomo, so can't we learn out? It has to be a Makam that's Meshulish, B'dam B'Basur V'Emurin, so we should learn it from that pasuk, and so then we are back to the question, what do we need the pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim for? And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Ashi said, Amrisa L'Shmaita Kami de Rav Masna, I said over this teaching in front of Rav Masna, Amar Li, and he said to me, Mehasim, if you only had that pasuk over there, Hav Amina, one might have thought Shlishi, that when it says Shlishi, again in this pasuk in Vayikra Zayin Yurches, Prat, we would have thought that that's a Prat, that's a specification, and Pigel, Klal, we would have thought that the word Pigel in that pasuk, again it goes on to say Bayom HaShlishi, the pasuk goes on to say Pigel Yiyah, so I would have thought that Pigel is a Klal, that's a generalization, it's a specification, followed by a generalization. Vinasa Klal Mosav ala Prat, the rule is that if you have a Klal that follows a Prat, so that adds on to the Prat. Visrabu Shar Mekomo, so I might have thought that you actually include other locations. It wouldn't have to be an area that's Meshulish, B'dam, B'basur, V'emurin, and so therefore Kamashmal, and that's why we need the pasuk in Parashas Kedoshim. Again, it tells us that it has to be an area that's Meshulish, B'dam, B'basur, U'v'emurin. And the Gemara continues, Tanu Rabban, and the rabbis taught, Vim he'achol yachel mibsar zevach shlamav, again, if he's going to eat from the b'sar zevach shlamav, that's the same pasuk, again, the longer pasuk in Vayikra, Zayin Yudches, that's how the pasuk starts off. Again, Vim he'achol yachel mibsar zevach shlamav bayom hashlishi. Amar Rabbi Eliezer says, Kof aznecha, cup your ear, lishmoa, to understand, to hear what this pasuk is talking about. And this was mentioned earlier. We mentioned the idea that even though the simple reading of the pasuk is talking about consuming a carbon late after the time, but really that's not what it's talking about. The pasuk really is talking about having an intention to consume the carbon after the allotted time, or to have an intention to consume the carbon outside of the proper place. It's talking about intention. It's not talking about actually consuming the carbon late. And so that's what Rabbi Eliezer is now saying. Cup your ear and listen to this explanation. This pasuk is talking about having an intention to eat from his carbon on the third day, meaning outside of the proper time. Maybe you'll say that the pasuk is talking about somebody who actually eats the carbon on the third day. He actually eats it late. Amrit, so we say achar shu kosher, that once it's already kosher, after the carbon's already accepted, because at the time he's eating it already on the third day, so the avoda was already done, everything was done, and it was an accepted carbon. Yachzor v'yifsol, do you think then that it's going to go return and become disqualified retroactively? It cannot be that a carbon becomes disqualified retroactively, and therefore it can't be talking about what it seems to be talking about. Rather, this pasuk must be talking about intention. That's the argument of Rabbi Eliezer. And the Gemara continues, Amar lo Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said to him, he said to Rabbi Eliezer, it's not true. We do find retroactive. We do find such an idea that something can take place retroactively in this fashion. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said to him, Hein matzinu bezav, v'zav v'shomeres yom keneged yom. We find by a zav and a shomeres yom keneged yom. These are all situations of emissions of tumah. So we find over there, shehein b'chezkas tari. You have cases over there where there's a presumption of purity. V'kevan sharo, and once they see sasru, it actually undoes that purity. You have this idea of retroactive. Afato al tatama, so you shouldn't be surprised also in this case as well. Sha'ava b'shochsha, that even though it was a kosher carbon, sheyachzor v'yifsol, that it should go back and it should become disqualified. You do find such a situation. Rashi explains, once you did the blood avodos properly, Rabbi Eliezer argues retroactively it can't become disqualified. And then Rabbi Akiva argues back, Zav, we find this by Zav and Zav Shepasku. Let's say you have a situation where a Zav, for example, is a male, a Zav is a female, and they see emissions, and then that stops. Limnos, you may see porn, and they begin to count the days of cleanliness or purity in order to become pure. Umanu dalero hayamim, and let's say they count 4 or 5 5 days. V'yimro, and then if they then see sasru kol minyanim, it undoes the entire count. Kedamrina b'Meseches nida, like we say in Meseches nida, v'achar titar, achar lekulan, shalotei tuma mafsekes, and there can't be any tuma interrupting. And v'shomeres yom keneged yom, we find the same thing by a shomeres yom keneged yom. That case is as follows: Haroa toch achad asar yom. Let's say a woman sees blood in the 11 days shebei nida lenida, which are between the time periods of the nida where she's expecting to see blood, where she's expecting her period. So now she sees it in a time where it's not expected. V'tav lo l'machar. So let's say she sees, and then she immerses the next day shachris in the morning. Harehi tahora. So the halacha is that she is considered pure at that moment. The mixas hayom kakulo, because we say part of the day is like the whole day. Utvilasa bayom, and she immerses in the day. Vim tira hayom, and if she then sees that day more blood, so sasra tarasa, it actually undoes her purity. V'adam v'kelim shenaga behen hayom, and any person or vessels that she touched that day, tamein lemafrei, they actually become tamei retroactively. You see this concept of retroactive tuma. Kedetanan b'perak beis denida, we learn this in the Mishnah, the second parak of Nida. V'shavin baroa toch achad asar yom v'chulu, that's what it says in the Mishnah. V'tavla b'yom shel achar v'shimsha harezu tarbus ro mago v'ilasa teluyin. Again, it says that what she does, what she touches, is suspended. V'zui teliyasan imtira hayom, and the idea of the suspension is as follows: that if she should see today, you tamein lemafrei, there's going to be tuma retroactively. V'chayavin b'karban, there'll be liability to a carbon. So again, that's Rabbi Akiva's argument that we do find this idea of retroactive tuma, and it might apply by karbanos as well. And the Brisa continues, Amar Lei, Rabbi Eliezer responds to Rabbi Akiva, Harehu Omer, but the Pasuk says Hamakriv, it says the one bringing the offering. And what does that mean? It means B'shas Hakravahu Nifsal. We're talking in this Pasuk about a psul, a disqualification that happens during the Hakrava, during the offering, which would be intention. V'eno Nifsal B'shlishi. We're not talking here about it becoming disqualified on the third day because it was eaten later. So that's how you know that we're not talking about retroactively over here. Rashi explains, Harehu Omer, Hamakriv b'hakrava nifsal. It's during the hakrava process, the offering process, that it becomes disqualified. The offering is not going to be accepted. That's how you understand the pasuk. And the Brisa continues, Oeino Omer Hamakriv. Maybe what it means when it says Hamakriv, maybe that's not what it means. Maybe it doesn't mean b'shas hakrava. Maybe it means Elozek Kohen Hamakriv. Maybe it's referring to the Kohen who is bringing the offering. Rashi explains, Elazek Kohen Hamakriv, maybe it's the Kohen who's bringing the offering, V'yamar Loch HaKosev, and the Pasuk is telling you, Shelo Yehei Kosher L'Kahuna, maybe the Pasuk is telling you that the Kohen is no longer kosher to serve. Ushma Mina Tarti, and the way Rashi understands this part of the Brisa is we'd be learning two things from here. Maybe we're learning both Shas HaKrava, we're learning that we are in fact talking about the moment, the time of HaKrava, Upsul Kohen, and maybe we're talking about the disqualification of the Kohen. Is that the meaning of the Pasuk? Oeino Omer Hamakriv Elazek Kohen Hamakriv. And to that, the Brisa says, Kishu Omer Oso, when it says the word Oso, Bezevachim Medaber, that's a reference to the carbon itself. We're talking about a disqualification of the carbon. Ve'eno Medaber V'Kohen. We're not talking about disqualifying the Kohen over here. And the Brisa continues, Ben Azai Omer, Ben Azai says, Oso, Matam Lomer. Why does the Pasuk say Oso? Just to see again the full pasuk, the pasuk says Hamakriv Oso Lo Yechashev. Again, we're saying before that that's a reference to the carbon, and now Ben Azai is saying Ben Azai Omer Oso Matam Lomer. Why does it say Oso? Lefi Shenemar. It's for a different reason. It's because the pasuk says Lo Sa'acher L'Shalmo. When a person has an obligation to bring a carbon, it says he should not delay from paying off, so to speak, that obligation, from bringing the carbon in the proper time. So Yachol Af Ma'acher Nidro Below Yeratza. So one might think, let's say somebody makes a neder, he makes an oath to bring a carbon, and then he delays bringing it. He's supposed to bring it by the regular. He has a certain number of regalim to bring it, and he doesn't do it. He brings it too late. Ma'acher Nidro. So one might think that's below Yeratza. One might think that will not be accepted. Talmud Lomar Oso. That's what it means when it says over here Oso. It means Oso below Yeratza. It means in this particular situation it's lo Yeratza. Again, in this particular situation of, let's say, having a machshava to bring it outside of the proper time, v'yein ha'ma'acher nidro below yeratza, and we learn from there, this is a case of lo yeratza, but ma'acher nidro, if somebody delays in fulfilling his neder, so that's not going to be lo yeratza, such a carbon will still be accepted, even though it's a late carbon, it still will be accepted. And the Brisa continues, Acherim Omer, Acherim say, the Acherim say, others say, Lo Yechashiv. What does it mean in the pasuk when it says Lo Yechashiv? Again, the pasuk says, "Hamakrivo so lo yechashev lo pigol yiyah." So the acherim they say, what does that mean when it says lo yechashev? It means b'machshavahu nifsal. It means to say that again we're talking here about a disqualification that happens through intention, as we explained above. V'eino nifsal b'shlishi. It's not talking about the fact that it's disqualified because because the carbon was consumed on the third day too late. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the intention that it be outside of the proper time. And Rashi explains, "B'machshavahu nifsal zeh mefurash min harishon." This is explained from the first, the hamakriv lo mashma lehu shas hakrav. In other words, the acherim, they don't want to learn this idea from hamakriv. That's how we learned it above. We said that hamakriv means the shas hakrava is when it's becoming disqualified. The shas hakrava means that during the hakrava you're having the wrong intention. Ad the gamar krola milsev yamar hamakriv oso lo yechoshev. It's only when you finish the pasuk that you can understand that that's what the pasuk means. Hamakriv oso lo yechoshev. B'machshava zos. It's talking about intention when it says lo yechashev, according to the acherim. Tahai lo yechashev lidrashahu. This lo yechashev is a drasha. Taksiv lo yeratz. It already says lo yeratz. It's not accepted. So what is lo yechashev adding? And so that's why the acherim say that what lo yechashev is adding is saying that it's the machshava. It's through the machshava, through the wrong intention, that there is this disqualification. And the Gemara continues and asks, so Ben Azai, now according to Ben Azai, who uses oso to teach that if a person brings the carbon late, that carbon is still accepted, so from where does he know that this pasuk is talking about the carbon and not the disqualification of the Kohen himself? Because again, we learned that from the word oso, but Ben Azai is using oso for something else. And the Gemara answers, if you want, we could say nafkalemi de acherim. He learns it out from the acherim. We'll see Rashi in a moment. If you want, we could say midachsiv lo yeratza, from the fact it says it's not accepted. V'lo yeratza zivchahu. Lo yeratza indicates an acceptance of a carbon. That's the kind of term that you would use by a carbon, and so therefore we understand we're not talking about a disqualification of the Kohen. Rashi explains it could be that he learns it nafkalemi de acherim. It could be he learns it from the acherim. Midi itzrich krola meimar ve'eino nifsal b'shlishi, meaning because the acherim understood the pasuk to be telling us that eino nifsal b'shlishi, the carbon is not disqualified if it's eaten on the third day. So Shema Mina Bezevach HaKos Medaber, just from that alone you see that we're talking about a disqualification of the carbon and not the Kohen. The Ibezoveach, because if we're talking about disqualifying the Kohen who brought the carbon, so Lama Yifsal B'Shlishi, why should the Kohen become disqualified because it's eaten on the third day? Halohulo Chata, he's not the one that committed that sin. Kiyama Ochel, it's the person who ate it late that committed that sin. Or it could be Ben Azai learns it midachsiv lishna de lo yeratza, the language of lo yeratza. V'lo yeratza zivchu. Lo yeratza is a language you would use by a carbon. De'in lashon lo yeratza nofel b'psul kohen. You wouldn't use the word lo yeratza by a disqualification of the kohen. And the Gemara continues, "Ben Azai oso below yeratza ve'in ma'acher nidro below yeratza mehacha nafka." Does Ben Azai really learn out that a ma'acher nidro, that the carbon is still accepted from here? Is that really the source? But mida acherim nafka, isn't that learned from the acherim? This is a different acherim in the following brisa. The Tanya, as we learned in the brisa, acherim omrim, acherim, the acherim say, others say, yachol yehei bechor she'ivra shenasa. One might think that a bechor, let's say its first year passed. Rashi explains, she'ivra shenasa v'zeu ichor. If the Bechor is already more than a year old, that also is delayed. Techsiv, because it's written in the pasuk, Lifnei Hashem Tochlenu Shana B'Shana, it says a year, it says each year, so it's supposed to be that the Bechor is brought in the first year, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Chav Tes Amud Beis.